Well, for those of you that don't already know me, my name is Lee Hills. I'm a partner at the law firm of Mayo, Wynne, Baxter. I've worked with and for the travel sector for about 30 years now. And so this morning, although we're focusing on some of the issues which have come to light and are of perhaps the greatest concern to businesses operating in the sector following the outbreak of the pandemic, I'm also going to be touching upon some of those issues which I come across from a legal perspective, representing the sector, and which are probably as much relevance now as they then were. So in the 20 minutes or so that we have, we're going to have a canter through some of these issues, and all I can really do at this point in the time I've got is to provide you with some pointers of areas that, if you're not already doing so, it might be a good time to think about. Now, I've used this analogy before, and it's not one that any of us would wish, but I've heard it said, and have used this example myself, that downturns and recessions are a little bit like pit stops in a Formula One race. The cars, being companies, are all whizzing around the track, trying to beat each other. And occasionally a downturn, a recession, in this case caused by a pandemic, comes along, and cars all slow down, the businesses slow down, and pull into the pit stop. And what can make a difference to those companies that come out of the pit stop first, but ultimately may end up winning the race, are some of the adjustments that are made to the business during the downtime. And so it is, even though I'm sure none of us wish that we where we are, it is an opportunity, and if you're not already doing so, it's worth using the time to put some of these measures in place. What you're going to see me doing, I think Sharon can see me doing, is the wonders of modern technology have defeated us slightly. So if you see me scratching my nose, I'm not actually bidding through a secret online auction that's showing my other screen, but it'll be a little sign to Sharon, who's controlling our PowerPoints this morning, to move them forward. So thank you, Sharon. That's the next slide. We can move that forward. Terrific. Now, this is just a little reminder of, irrespective of the awful times we're experiencing, but even in better times, some of the reasons why it's good to make sure that your business, and from my perspective, from the legal side of things, is put into the best order that it can be to prevent complaints, which can ultimately lead to claims for compensation and a host of other awful things happening. Just looking at some of these facts and figures that come from pre-COVID, you can see that those of you who may be members of ABTA itself receives some 22,000 complaints from customers each year, half of which lead to arbitration referrals. And of those 11,000, ABTA making an excess year in, year out, some £2 million worth of awards against its members. That's something which is obviously good to avoid. There is an inherent risk, particularly in the litigious society in which we have come to live and operate, of claims for accidents and injuries. And tour operators are particularly susceptible to these because, unlike most other businesses, they can and do accept what we call vicarious liability for the acts of their suppliers who have perhaps performed some of the individual component parts of the holiday, irrespective of whether they were the cause of those or not. Now, those, you will be insured, I'm sure, public liability insurance, but irrespective, like any type of insurance, it's going to lead to increased premiums, it's going to eat into any excess that you've agreed on your insurance policy, and ultimately, and we're seeing this now from conversations I'm having with professional colleagues and referrers who also work for this sector, but within the insurance industry, the market is hardening, and premiums are increasing, and with reduced income, ultimately businesses, tour operators could become uninsurable. So again, another reason just to take note of some of the matters we're going to be touching upon later. Thank you, Sharon. Again, just touching on a few other causes, misrepresentation. This is going to be relevant when we come to look at the information that you have but are continuing to share with your customers and potential customers relating to your product. Misrepresentation as a cause of action in civil claims. It's a standalone action that your customers could bring against you in the county courts, but also, when we look at this shortly, it can lead to a criminal wrong, prosecutions by trading standards, which in the current regime carry unlimited fines in the magistrates' court. And just for the travel industry alone, and again, this is pre-COVID, leading to some in excess of 8,000 complaints a year to trading standards, some of which may lead to criminal prosecutions and fines. And then, of course, what is difficult to measure, but is nevertheless equally important, is the adverse publicity, because we all depend on our reputations, and with the growth of social media and the majority of perhaps bookings being made over the internet, some of the review sites, touched on there, Google, Trustpilot, etc., are important. And if you're getting poor reviews through not managing your processes and procedures, that's going to have an impact down the line. Thank you, Sharon. Lastly, something that not everyone is necessarily aware of, but I think is of importance. I've certainly come across it before when acting for travel businesses, is the Advertising Standards Authority. That's a consumer-facing complaints body that will investigate misleading adverts that are placed. Adverts, in this case, perhaps being the holidays, the products that you're selling. Again, so 11,000 complaints a year, increase, perhaps understandably, as a result of online advertising. But the consequences of an adverse ruling against you by the ASA, following a complaint by perhaps one of your customers, but it also, I have seen, I've got to say, competitors of businesses making mischievous complaints to the ASA, will result in a public ruling that'll be open to the public to see. Ultimately, your adverts can be required to be amended or removed. There's additional cost that arises from that. And finally, if non-compliance continues, trading standards can get involved and can bring a criminal prosecution. So it's probably just stating the obvious, but there's a few things there for you to bear in mind as to why now may be a good time to just do a review of some of your processes and procedures that we're going to come on to next. Sharon, thank you. From the 1st of July 2018, the England and Wales introduced and enacted the European Package Travel Directive, the new one that replaced the regulations that have been in force since 1992. Much of it is fairly similar, but there are some changes that have come from it. But of course, COVID's now hit, and the lawyers and the courts and the regulators really have yet to get their teeth into the interpretation of these regulations and for them to be properly tested. But I'm going to touch upon some of the areas that are similar to the pre-2018 regulations, but are still new, and perhaps matters that you should think about, particularly in the context of the changing landscape that has come from the pandemic. Now, specifically within the regulations, Regulation 6 refers to your brochures and online content, the products that you are displaying to your customers obviously in the hope of gaining their business. One of the things you do need to be careful of is that what you say in your product information will form an integral part of the contract. Now, pre-2018, the lawyers would refer to online content, brochure content, as being an implied warranty. And there were arguments as to whether or not that warranty formed part of the contract and therefore an obligation that you would have to fulfill and be bound by, or whether it's simply advertising puff. Now, that hasn't yet been tested by the court since 2018, but what you may have, the words and the images that you may have used to describe your product, what you're able to offer, what you are offering, the destination, may very well and probably will be different now than it was this time last year because of the restrictions that have been imposed upon us. So I mention that now because it is useful, if you haven't already done so, to review what you are promising to your customers in your content and what you can actually deliver. Thank you, Sharon. Again, I'm sure most of you, certainly on the tour operating side, will be familiar with some of the requirements that are imposed upon you in terms of what information you need to provide to your customers prior to the booking. Now, I've just bullet pointed some of these in this next slide, but the information is contained within Schedule 1 to the regulations, but include the main characteristics of the travel service. That is, the location that they're going to, what the main features of the accommodation are, the travel and transport, what you are saying that you will provide to the customer. Now, you're not warrantying, of course, that the sun's going to shine or that there are going to be dolphins swimming in the bay or whatever, but those main characteristics you are bound by. And so once again, I think in the current landscape, it is worth reviewing what you have said and what product information you've designed if it were designed prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. I also mention information about the suitability for customers' needs. Now, the regulations do refer to essentially people with mobility issues, but upon specific request by the customer, if they ask you about the suitability of the product, the destination, what it is for their needs, then you're required to provide it. And again, this is untested, uncharted waters, but I can see it that it is conceivable that if you have a customer that perhaps had a pre-existing condition or susceptibility to perhaps more serious illness from COVID, and they were to ask you about the destination, the product, in relation to that, you may need to provide it. It's uncharted waters, but I can see it. I can see it as certainly a possibility, and therefore I think it is important. And we'll again come to this later on in the talk to ensure that your information about your product is as up to date as possible. Thank you, Sharon. Again, just touching upon, we're looking at areas of obligations and areas of liability. Again, you're going to be familiar with this, I'm sure, if you're a tour operator. And it isn't a great deal different to what the pre-1st of July 18 regulations said. But liability can arise through the performance of the travel services. If there's a lack of conformity, i.e. you are not delivering what you have promised to deliver, so it's important for you to think, what are you promising I'm going to deliver? That can result in a price reduction, or if it amounts to a very significant failure on your part, ultimately it could lead to a refund and compensation. Thank you, Sharon. I touched upon this earlier when we were talking about areas of potential exposure. There is a standalone set of regulations that you may be familiar with, that trading standards enforce, unfair trading regulations 2008, that apply to any consumer facing businesses, but again provides an area of risk, I suppose, to you for either providing false or misleading information, again, as to the main characteristics of the holiday, or omitting material information. And this may include what's happening on the ground. Thank you, Sharon. And this is enforced by trading standards, indeed of criminal liability, unlimited fines, but equally defences, not only to civil claims, but ultimately, if you had the misfortune of facing a criminal prosecution, due diligence is a defence. So evidence checks, procedures, documentation, trail, audits that Colin will touch upon are important to not only have conducted, but to have to hand. So worthwhile, again, just getting your house in order now, if not for now, then for the future when people start travelling again. Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to skip across this next slide because it sort of overlaps a bit with what Colin's going to talk about in terms of auditing. But again, it reinforces the importance of what Colin will talk about. With pre-season and ongoing auditing of the main characteristics, products of your product. Thank you, Sharon. This is important, and it goes back to what I was saying very early on in the talk about liability for brochure online content and the positive consequences of failing to do that generally, but particularly now. If there are changes that have arisen to what the main characteristics of your products are, or what actually is available and what you're suggesting is available to customers, then I think you need to have in place measures and processes for updating and amending these, issuing erratas to agents or the suppliers as and when they arise. Again, I mentioned this, it's not something that a lot of people always think about, but if you have telesales operatives or agents that are operating from scripts, then ensure their product information is up to date, whether it's hard copy or online. And again, there is no legal precedent for this, but I think a lot of businesses have been issuing a general sort of COVID caveat on their website, stating perhaps the obvious, as Basil Fawlty might say, but that things are different, and things are going to change, and in perhaps reinforcing the need for customers to, where possible, make their own inquiries or draw them to sites where information can be obtained about what is happening at the destination in the resort. Thank you, Sharon. Booking conditions is something that I have banged on about to clients, not from a self-serving perspective, but for their own benefit for many years, but is equally important now. It's worth using the time because I think many businesses that I've come across, particularly tour operators, surprisingly still haven't updated their booking conditions to ensure that they reflect the additional obligations that are imposed upon them by the new regulations. They're not providing key notices, key rights notices, as they're required to do by law. And, you know, potentially are accepting greater potential liability and responsibility that they need to through their booking additions, because, for example, they may be selling products or combining products that would not fall within the category of a package, but nevertheless haven't changed their T's and C's and are contractually accepting responsibility, even though they wouldn't do so under the regulations. Excursions has been a long-standing issue for us as lawyers, where we've seen that an excursion is sold perhaps in resort or separately to the package, but nevertheless through the T's and C's, the company has accepted the same liability and responsibility for those as they would for the rest of the package, and it's not necessary. And again, I think worth reinforcing, particularly at the moment, that it's local standards by which you are judged in respect of any claims or complaints, and not UK standards. And very often, maybe less so at the moment, I don't know, but they're going to be lower than in resort. Thank you, Sharon. This again is a real bugbear of mine, and I've heard many businesses saying that they wish they had reviewed their contracts with their external suppliers, particularly the providers of products, transport accommodation providers, or their DMCs or ground agents. And it is important now. We've seen and read about how many hotels have not been refunding, or have tour operators in scenarios where the regulations have required the operator to refund customers. And I appreciate that there's only so much you can do through contracts, and indeed they require the suppliers to accept your contracts, but they should be reviewed, and the obligations that you have, if you are an operator, to your customers, particularly in refunds, you should try to mirror those in the obligations that your suppliers have to you, to put you in the best position for securing refunds in the event of a situation such as this either becoming exacerbated or continuing for the foreseeable future. And indeed, where suppliers perhaps are DMCs or ground agents, make sure that there is, if not a contractual obligation on their part, then a working arrangement for them to keep you updated and appraised of what is actually happening in resort. Thank you, Sharon, who's flashing at me that time is marching on. So if I speak quicker, it's not the 3 cups of coffee I've already drunk. Okay. Again, this links through to your content, but also the arrangements that you have with overseas suppliers. I think that if information and photographs, for example, that you may have obtained from them are displayed in your product information are no longer relevant, then not only do they need to be changed, but any agreements that you have with suppliers. And I'm banging on about tour operators here, but of course I appreciate that the audience doesn't necessarily comprise totally of tour operators. If there are suppliers who themselves have subcontractors for part of the supply process, what I'm talking about applies equally to them for the benefit of them. But there should be warranties and indemnities from suppliers or subcontractors that if they mess up, they don't provide you with the information that they're contracted to provide, and that results in claims against you by your customers, then the contracts include indemnity in your favour, and possibly, cash being king, possession being 9/10 of the law, retention clauses on the part of the party paying the contract, perhaps to hold on to the money and pay a little bit further down the line. So if things go wrong, you've got the money and you have the opportunity to retain that pending resolution of any dispute. I've thrown in there again force majeure clauses. Force majeure is something which, a word expression we've heard bandied around quite a bit lately, and I think is going to lead to a lot of litigation over the next couple of years or so. The legal draftsmen have updated their clauses, standard template clauses, to ensure that there is specific reference to pandemics. And it's important that you, if you're using force majeure clauses, if you look at nothing else, you ensure that they are up to date and cover you and protect you as best they can, but particularly for pandemics. And law and jurisdiction clauses, most lawyers will tell you that it's much, much easier for you to, if you have to get involved with the courts, to do so in England than to have to do so overseas. So they're just some key areas that I think are worth looking at in any contracts. Thank you, Sharon. Again, we touched upon this, but just to reinforce what obligations tour operators particularly have, there is an enhanced obligation to provide appropriate and prompt assistance to travellers in difficulties overseas, and so with the the heightened anxiety that's arisen as a result of the pandemic, I think it's important to ensure that you have those systems in place, and here have points of reference in each of your destinations, either directly or through your local agents, with consulars, health authorities, and the ability to provide help and advice on the ground if it's necessary. You can charge for it in certain circumstances, but that's very often something which doesn't involve a lot of money and is argued about further down the line, but is important to comply with your obligations, but also to show that you're taking it seriously, and to perhaps improve those reviews, which are going to be all important and might provide you with the edge next year. Thank you, Sharon. And again, these are areas which we've touched upon, but linked through to the last slide. Training, anybody that has employed resort staff or through local agents, make sure they are up to date and aware and familiar with the concerns, the worries that your customers in the UK, if it is the UK, may have relating to COVID. And my experience, having acted for tour operators and a whole range of travel sector businesses for 30 years, big and small, is that those that have the best track record are those that are able to nip complaints in the bud in resort or immediately upon return to the UK. There's one operator, large operator I act for, who have one of the best records in the industry, and that was because if they hadn't resolved issues in resort, then as soon as the customer landed, they were on the phone to them, and before they got to the grubby, greedy lawyers to start bringing claims. So again, an area of the business which I think is worth reviewing now in the COVID world in which we're presently operating, but will also put you in good stead for the future. Thank you, Sharon. Time is ticking on. I said this was going to be a really quick canter through, and it is. Stating the obvious again, if you take the time now, time that many of us very often don't have when we're busy rushing around that racetrack trying to beat each other, not only, I think, may it help you leave that pit stop first and ultimately pass the checkered flag first, it's going to help you with, as I said there, improved product quality, definitely lower overheads, customer retention, which is king, and ultimately an improved bottom line.